Thus, the zone as a mirror of the human soul or mind, as portrayed in the film, takes on form within the game as well. However, this impossibility stems not only from the corrupt nature of humanity, but also from man's inability to comprehend phenomena in all their complexity or to calculate the consequences of various actions, both prerequisites for any planned reality. Ideals, just like any form of divinity, remain knowable only in a relative referential sense. As such, absolute good or evil captivate the mind as concepts, but remain elusive as empirical phenomena. The fate of humanity continues, and the darkness of the cosmos remains unscathed, let alone diminished. As with our historical experience, the actions undertaken by the sea consciousness liberated from the burden imposed by nature, while simultaneously making it dependent on the newly established system. One determinism is replaced by another, and therefore Omega, as previously said, can be nothing more than the alpha of a new phase. As agriculture once freed humans from constant movement and uncertain hunting success, paving the way for population booms and the rise of civilization, it also bound them to the land, to the hard labor of cultivation and the bureaucratic state structures necessary for massive irrigation projects. In the same way, the sea consciousness, despite all its excesses, becomes ensnared in the effort to close the rift in the noosphere while also trying to fend off the curious explorers whose probing only exacerbates its existence. In offering a solution to previous afflictions, it creates new ones it must contend with. This, of course, does not mean that everything is an illusion, that no progress exists. On the contrary, but it does mean that there is no end, and that utopia is only magical so long as it remains an idea. It means that there is no divine spirit, prime mover, or predetermined end to dictate the rhythm of progress, only man with his ideas, knowledge, ignorance, ethics, and perversions. Once the idea enters the phase of realization, disillusionment sets in and the vast gulf between ambitions and capabilities becomes apparent. Yet this too opens up a whole array of ethical questions shaped by everything we've said so far. Thus, within the framework of this evolutionary leap, a central dilemma emerges. Is a morally acceptable form of unanimity possible on the path towards the elevation of consciousness? After all, the endpoint of monism, as we've described it, inherently demands the eventual emergence of such a state. How many readers then would be surprised by the following quote from a letter addressed to Tsiolkovsky regarding the contents of his work? You are a materialist in your conclusions and investigations, and in your monism you are very much aligned with us, the communists, who are also monists in the sphere of social relations and economics. Of course, the fact that one reader observes this similarity in no way implicates Tsiolkovsky or Teilhard de Chardin for that matter. The latter, given the time in which he wrote, was fully aware of the problem of totalization that arises from what he perceived as noogenesis. He even notes that there has never been a historical period in which humanity was so well equipped and ready to organize its multiplicity, only to be faced with the glaring lessons of Nazism and communism, which clearly demonstrated the process of entrapment. So we get the crystal instead of the cell, the anthill instead of brotherhood. Instead of the upsurge of consciousness which we expected, it is mechanization that seems to emerge inevitably from totalization. However, he does not consider such outcomes a reason to abandon the process. Rather, he asserts that the tragedy of totalitarianism lies in its having distorted something magnificent while being so close to the truth. The only crucial difference, he argues, is that the work of the great human machine must not be reduced solely to material production, but must generate a superabundance of mind. Nevertheless, the communist experience remains relevant, not only due to its attempts at establishing mental uniformity or because of the earlier quoted enthusiastic reader. Guided by an eschatological belief in the inevitability of utopia, all communist movements undertook concrete actions that resulted in consequences antithetical to their proclaimed ideals. Here too, the imagined end goal, as a telos necessarily emerging from what was recognized as the logic of historical development, fed activity and gave rise to communism, not because it was inevitable, but because its adherents believed it to be and did everything in their power to bring it about. Of course, one might always ask why act at all if the outcome is already a necessary consequence of the flow of history. And yet, the depth of their conceptual error is made even more evident by the fact that those disillusioned by past failures, as well as many enthusiasts today, never gave up their belief that true communism had never been tried, privileging fantasy over concrete experience. What had been lived through was thus interpreted as nothing more than a deviation from the ideal, a betrayal of the revolution or the birth pangs of a new world. Such a worldview gave rise and still gives rise to the oft-used justification that cloaks its inherent cruelty or the callousness of self-proclaimed genius in naive poeticism. The idea that you have to break a few eggs to make an omelette. If we reduce the argument to the rawest emotional level using visceral response as our ethical compass, we might say that even some revolutionaries who ended up on the garbage heap of history came to feel that such a metaphor only sounds acceptable until the eggs being broken become you and your loved ones. And while we're on the subject of metaphors, it's worth noting that every omelette only satisfies hunger for a time. Soon, new eggs must be laid on the altar of an eternally ravenous appetite. Revolution, like the zone, consumes until the very end. Still, that hasn't stopped some exceptional individuals from preemptively justifying the sacrifices they knew would be inevitable on the ascent toward the grandeur they envisioned. So let us return to Tsiolkovsky. Let us say that a strange genius appears in a country, one whom the majority cannot understand due to the lofty nature of his ideas. That genius is like a man among apes. A great chasm separates him from the masses. He is invisible to the people and thus cannot be elected by them. But a few understand him. They are convinced that he is humanity's salvation. That small group begins to rule a small state and then several states. They are ruthless, marked by all kinds of violence. But being convinced of their own righteousness and benevolence, they feel no shame in breaking common laws and conventional morality. 90% of the population does not understand them and therefore suffers violence, not moving forward by its own will, but through fear, threats, and suffering. Could something like this happen in life? It is possible, though it may end in ruin if the minority fails to overcome the majority and bring them to its side. Such an organization could last a long time. The shepherd strikes his flock with a whip to save it from hunger, cold, and predators. The flock cannot overthrow the shepherd. Ecce ille inquisitor magnus. Behold the grand inquisitor. Behold the benefactor of mankind. Conventional morality, lashes of the whip and salvation. What pregnant words spoken, it seems, so easily. Here we encounter a problem that rises from the aforementioned levels of reflection. Simply put, no one can dispute the genius of either Tsiolkovsky or Teilhard de Chardin. But the question we must always keep in mind is, what if on the road to the Omega point, the Lightbringer intervenes? Not as a villain, we expect nothing good from that sort, but as an extraordinary individual who illuminates the way, though his light shines over a pitifully small portion of the surrounding darkness, always in danger of being overwhelmed by it. Both forward and back, its reach remains limited. Even if the beam is intensified, the focus must be narrowed, leaving us with a metaphor for the drop of knowledge in the ocean of ignorance. What if two or more unusual geniuses appear who agree on what they see, but not on what to do? And what if, on top of that, a decision must be made quickly, requiring knowledge to be translated into action with all the limitations we've discussed? What, ultimately, if the genius and the few who understand him make a catastrophic mistake that costs everyone, not just themselves? So the issue is not only evil, but the structure of reality itself and the inherent impossibility of achieving absolute knowledge or of resolving the tension between order and chaos. Teilhard de Chardin believed that if there is a future for mankind, it can only be imagined in terms of a harmonious constellation of what is free with what is planned and totalized. But in the game we see that the pessimism of the Strugatsky brothers ultimately prevails. Pessimism born from both deep contemplation and the practical experience of various totalization experiments. The attempt to resolve the tension between order and chaos through the evolution of consciousness also collapses, given that the reality is practically infinite and no mind can encompass it fully. Thus, the very thing described in the segment on Limansk and the experiment inevitably occurs. Omega becomes everything at the cost of other lives. Its survival becomes both Alpha and Omega, even if that means erasing free will through mental control and enforce unanimity. The zone devours, enslaves, and spreads, but rather than uniting into a suprapersonal entity, it, save for the few chosen, returns to impersonality. In the end, we do not get the Omega as an absolute God, but remain with a relative and referential divinity. See consciousness is agnostic demiurge, the creator of the world, the son of Sophia, of knowledge or wisdom, who creates an imperfect world in his own imperfect image. Like the God of the Old Testament, he leaves humans in ignorance, bound to material reality, punishing their attempts to attain knowledge. Unlike the benefactors of humanity in the film, who would use the room as a divine gift, the benefactors in the game create the wish granter themselves, like parents offering a glittering lie to keep their children distracted while they work. Like the black monolith from 2001: A Space Odyssey, which functions as an evolutionary module, a creator or even controller of the simulation, the monolith in Stalker represents the manifestation of humanity's evolutionary leap from product of spontaneous flow to architect of planned development. The mind, as a product of spontaneous evolution, becomes convinced that it is a part of a greater developmental plan and begins to act accordingly, thus transforming itself into the architect of that very plan. See consciousness becomes the black monolith of 2001: A Space Odyssey. With this, we circle back to the monolith as a point of evolutionary transition, an Omega that is not an end but the beginning of a new struggle and new determinisms that must be overcome. Life remains life, even in its superior form.